Tired of big tech clashing with your Catholic values? Fide Chat is now live on the Apple App Store and Google Play Store. It's private, encrypted, and built by Catholics for Catholics, with features like parental controls and more. Connect securely with family, friends, and groups. Download Fide Chat at fide.email. Technology without compromise. You may be aware that Pope Leo XIV is set to name Cardinal John Henry Newman as a doctor of the church. That's a big deal. And this has some people concerned. And the reason that traditionally minded and traditionalist Catholics are so concerned about this is because Cardinal John Henry Newman's name is invoked, perhaps more than anybody else's, in the defense of the radical changes inflicted upon the church after Vatican II. Whether it's a result of the council and its documents or just some secretive plan by those in positions of authority in the church at the time, I'll leave you to debate here. I tend to place the blame on the council itself because the same people who wrote those documents, addressed those documents at the council, debated them, and voted on their passage at the council were the same ones who then went back to their dioceses to implement them. But no serious Catholic thinks Vatican II was the source and summit of our problems, because the church was in a state of crisis for a century beforehand. Vatican II was just in a major inflection point in the crisis. But on the Newman subject, his name is invoked by modernists to defend everything that came after, invoking his development of doctrine idea. Now, there have been some very thoughtful defenses against this done by the likes of Dr. Peter Kwasniewski and others, pointing out that his concept of the development of doctrine, if you actually read Newman, is fine. That's not the subject we're debating here. What we're going to go here into is an in-depth look at a piece written by Father Dave Nix at Padre Peregrino, his blog, Padre Peregrino, where he explains what it is the modernists are doing by elevating Cardinal Newman to the post of Doctor of the Church, and it's their misuse of the concept of the development of doctrine. For those of you who are against the concept of the development of doctrine, in this piece that you'll hear, Father Dave Nix does address this question, and he addresses it directly. And he shows that Cardinal Newman understood what he was talking about, and that there really isn't a problem with the idea that concepts and theology develop over time as long as it remains the same. And he uses as an example in this that a small child, a newborn baby, is the same substance and person that it was at birth as it is when it's in middle age. And if we apply that principle to the development of theology, then you begin to see that what grows cannot change. Our understanding grows, but the meanings and definitions don't change. Now, we're going to let Father Dave Nix do this. I'm going to be going over his piece that he published just a few days ago, the Padre Peregrino blog, under the headline, Cardinal Newman and the Development of Doctrine. We'll just go over his article directly. John Henry Cardinal Newman was a 19th century British convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism. In full transparency, I should be clear that today I am not going to assess his controversial views of the inerrancy of Scripture or evolution. Also, the topic of whether Newman would be a good candidate for a future valid canonization is better tackled by the WM Review here. Today, I'm only going to assess his teaching on the development of doctrine and what that means for Catholics in the 21st century. As a Jesuit-educated 20-year-old in the late 1990s, I had been told by many in my life at that point that all the dogmatic and liturgical changes that followed Vatican II were all bona fide, quote, developments of doctrine. I wanted to see if that was true, so the first book I could find on that topic was Cardinal Newman's Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. That essay is over 300 pages long. It was a lot to handle as a kid whose Catholic life was spent learning from bus nuns and downtown soup kitchens up to that point, but I understood most of it. Cardinal Newman's view of the development of doctrine can be summarized in his Section 1, First Note of a Genuine Development, Preservation of Type, where he writes, and now we quote Cardinal Newman directly. This is readily suggested by the analogy of physical growth, which is such that the parts and proportions of the developed form, however altered, correspond to those which belong to its rudiments. The adult animal has the same make as it had on its birth. Young birds do not grow into fishes, nor does the child degenerate into the brute, wild, or domestic, of which he is by inheritance lord. Vincentius of Lerins, St. Vincent of Lerins, adopts this illustration in distinct reference to Christian doctrine. Quoting St. Vincent of Lerins, "Let the soul's religion," he says, "imitate the law of the body, which as years go on, develops indeed and opens out its due proportions, and yet remains identically what it was. Small are a baby's limbs, a youth's are larger, yet they are the same." End quote. As someone who was pre-med at Boston College at the time, this analogy made a lot of sense. Although Newman didn't know what DNA was in the 19th century, he obviously understood that a baby boy was the same person as who he would be as an adult man later in his life. So also for dogma. It can change by addition, but not subtraction. And even then, there are caveats around doctrinal addition. For example, it must be slow, conservative, and natural. Never a grotesque outgrowth to the original development or deposit of faith. Although the word Trinity is not in the New Testament explicitly, it is there implicitly anytime the divinity of Christ is affirmed. The genetics, so to speak, of our faith have everything in seminal form in Scripture and apostolic tradition. Thus, the deposit of the faith can only grow beautifully and more strong, never into a Frankenstein. True doctrine can only grow in a manner that is slow, conservative, nonviolent, non-grotesque, and natural. A baby grows into a man or a woman capable of doing more, never less. This is why Cardinal Newman just quoted St. Vincent of Lerins, with his analogy of doctrine to human biology, where any true development of doctrine, quote, imitate the law of the body, which as years go on, develops indeed and opens out its due proportions, and yet remains identically what it was. Cardinal Newman wrote elsewhere in his same essay, quote, "No doctrine is defined until it is violated. Thus he implies all of Catholic dogma is in either explicit form or implicit form in what Christ gave the apostles. The deposit of the faith must stay identically the same through every century of the Church, even if it be given new weapons to fight novel heresies of each age." End quote. And we're going to pause in this examination here for just a moment. St. Vincent of Lerins, I covered his entire work, the Commentary, in my educational video series over the course of a year and a half on this channel in small digestible portions. I highly recommend you read it because in there is the best defense of what is called the recognize and resist position. Therein, the work, the Commentary by St. Vincent of Lerins, who should be a doctor of the Church, but for some reason isn't, he tells his readers that they are to resist the promulgation of error, what he called novelty, in the Church, regardless of which office it came from. He did not put any special caveat on obeying the Holy Father if he promotes novelty. St. Vincent of Lerins, instead, one of the Church Fathers, tells you, the reader, to resist it and cling to what you had been given. Cling to tradition. Understand this. What Newman is doing, according to Father Dave Nix, is defending what came before against novelty. That doctrine develops, but it doesn't ever include novelty, the addition of things that were not part of the deposit of faith. I'm curious if you agree with that or if you don't. And I say that in that, do you agree that Cardinal Newman that's what he's doing and that what he's doing is orthodox, or whether he is really just a wolf in sheep's clothing? I know people are very divided on this, and I'm not entirely sure what I think of Cardinal Newman on this front myself, but I am not one who is driven to hysterics over Cardinal Newman. I have some of his essays on this channel, honestly. His writings on the Antichrist are fantastic. We'll continue here. For example, St. John and St. Mary never doubted the Trinity in the first century living together in Ephesus. But once the heretic Arius, a few hundred years after them, sowed seeds of doubt into the minds of millions of Christians, saints like Athanasius had to make more specific statements on the divinity of Christ and the Trinity in several infallible ecumenical dogmatic Christological councils and creeds. Of course, St. Athanasius believed the same things as St. John the Beloved about the Trinity, even if their vocabulary was slightly different. Hence the beautiful line from Newman, "No doctrine is defined until it's violated." Clearly, the Protestants would apply this to their own rebellion. The quote-unquote reformers of the 16th century might well have said, "The Roman papists diverted from apostolic Christianity with their indulgences and superstitions, and we had to correct the errors of the papists by returning Europe to early Christianity." But Newman, a convert from Protestantism to Catholicism, saw through this argument. The good Cardinal saw that Protestantism was not a development unto life, but one unto death. As he wrote, quote, "Luther started on a double basis, his dogmatic principle being contradicted by his right of private judgment, and his sacramental by his theory of justification. The sacramental element never showed signs of life, but on his death, that which he represented in his own person as a teacher, the dogmatic gained the ascendancy." Cardinal Newman lived in the 19th century. What would he think of the current doctrinal and liturgical wars in the Catholic Church of the 21st century? Would he call these valid developments of doctrine? And quote, and you're going to now be going into territory that some of you won't like, because he uses then Bishop Robert Prevost's own statements on X as examples of these errors. For those who may not be aware somehow, Bishop Robert Prevost became Cardinal Robert Prevost, and he then became Pope Leo XIV, the present Pope. That's why we're giving you the warning that we're heading into a dicey place here for some people. But it's telling. Within a few days of becoming Pope, his account on X was deleted. That didn't stop some news outlets from quoting him extensively on there. If you want, I can, in a future broadcast, show you the things that were said by the likes of the National Catholic Reporter, quoting him directly. Now, they and the secular media went after the President of the United States using then Cardinal and previous to that Bishop Robert Prevost's statements on X, now formerly Twitter, because those are what they focused on. But you're going to hear other statements here that were from him, and my only beef with this is, while I trust the source because I don't believe Father Dave Nix would misrepresent anything, nor do I believe Dr. Ed Mazza would misrepresent anything, unfortunately the accounts are deleted. So unless there are archived screenshots out there, we have to take their word for it, and I do take their word for it because I do believe they are men of integrity and that they do fear what would happen to them if they were to misrepresent what the Pope is saying when it comes time for their judgment. With that caveat, here is Father Dave Nix on why you're seeing this move now. This summer of 2025, Dr. Ed Mazza was on the new YouTube channel of Mr. Stephen Cokes to discuss the papacy. Just after the 23-minute and 30-second mark, Dr. Mazza explains that the once Bishop Prevost's X or Twitter account promoted the heresies of Amoris Laetitia as, quote, an authentic development of Catholic doctrine. Boom. There you go. Now you see why Cardinal Newman is being weaponized by the leftists in the Vatican. It's clearly to claim that Francis's heresies are development of doctrine. Also, Chicago-born Leo once thanked Illinois Governor Pat Quinn for abolishing the ultimate penalty the state can impose, and supported Francis's heretical statements that the penalty was always inadmissible. This is a distortion of doctrine. Even Pope John Paul II walked the church right up to the line of questioning that penalty in practical matters, but never crossed that doctrinal line of claiming it was inadmissible. Why? Because he knew a valid pope could never fully overturn a defined dogma of the Catholic Church, namely that the state has the right to execute certain criminals. See Romans chapter 13, and over 200 popes who sided with that penalty in definitive magisterial statements. It's obvious. Cardinal Newman is now being promoted as a mascot, not for the evolution of weapons against heretics, but for a novel devolution of true Catholic dogma, under the pretext of development. Is any of this an organic development of doctrine of theology? Of course not. No more than a tumor could grow within a perfectly healthy baby. Thus, there is no chance that Cardinal Newman, despite his small doctrinal flaws, could ever support these new tumors growing in the Vatican. They're not natural or beautiful or even Catholic for that matter. The claim is that he is being misused. And I don't think Father Dave Nix is wrong on that. I do think that he is accurate, because we've seen this going on for decades. They have tried to shoehorn into Cardinal Newman things that I don't think were necessarily there. And that is not denying that there are problems in some of Cardinal Newman's writings. I'll go back to things I've said repeatedly on this channel. There have been signs of a crisis in the church, in the episcopate, among the bishops and cardinals, and priests too, going back to the mid-19th century. Like the 1820s, you had one of the popes, I want to say Gregory the 16th, I think it was, writing an encyclical worried about all sort of the weird novelties being taught by popes or by priests and bishops. And he was trying to correct those matters. You had Pope Pius X write Pascendi in 1907. He promulgated the oath against modernism not long after. He crushed a religious order in Poland because they were promoting some wild doctrinal stuff. This stuff wasn't new. And so, steeped in that environment, it's not entirely implausible that Cardinal Newman may have been caught up in some of that himself, but nowhere near to the degree that the modernists are claiming. They claim him as their champion, almost as if he is a counter to the hermeneutic of continuity, when he's not. In a pure framing of the state of the church and a pure understanding of it through the hermeneutic of continuity, if you are married at the hip to the hermeneutic of continuity, Cardinal Newman is your go-to saint for defending the hermeneutic of continuity. He's probably the best mind there is, aside from, of course, Pope Benedict XVI himself, for that. But if you are not a hermeneutic of continuity person, like myself, there's clear that there was some sort of disjunction in the aftermath of Vatican II. People can debate what it means, but the modernists admit that it's a different church. They say that. They use that language all the time. They call it the new synodal church. You should take them at their word sometimes when they say this stuff. But if you are a hermeneutic of continuity person, Cardinal Newman gives you the best defense. You just have to tackle his doctrinal issues that Father Dave Nix alluded to. But all that having been said, this is why that the modernists are overjoyed at the elevation of Cardinal Newman to being a doctor of the church. Now, I don't know if the Pope that's his reasoning, or if maybe he's received special graces of the office and he's doing it for other reasons. We'll pray and hope for the latter, but be prepared for the former. I'm curious what you think about this, so let me know in the comments. Please hit a like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps too, and as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.